take over.
All right. It's always good to like make the host sweat a little bit when you're being invited on a webinar presentation. I'm Zoe from Jasper Hill Farm, and today I'm going to present on the first domain, I believe, for the CCP study guide, which is milk. Much more interesting than you'd think for a bland and relatively flavorless liquid. So a little preface here, I totally echo Nathan's encouragement to just keep studying, especially if maybe you have less time socializing in your life these days. Replacing it with a little bit of study is a great idea. I love the CCP exam because it has created a culture of learning and teaching in cheese that didn't exist before that exam came about. And whether or not you end up a certified cheese professional, having participated in this program is really cool, and I think will increase your level of professionalism in the cheese world without a doubt. You're being exposed to all kinds of new ideas, and I think if nothing else at the end of this process, you'll be armed with the ability to ask better questions and to absorb more information about cheese for the rest of your career. So thank you for being brave and taking up the torch. CCP, I know it's a daunting thing, so I'll try to sprinkle in some tips as we go here. So when we're talking about milk, topic at hand today, it's important to remember that it has its own ingredients. You know, usually we start with what's cheese made out of. Milk, salt, rennet cultures, right? That's a presentation for another day. Milk, salt, rennet, and cultures. And that short list of ingredients is accurate, but I think it glosses over a really important situation, which is that milk itself has its own ingredients. So milk is one ingredient in cheese making, but milk has its own ingredients, and those ingredients are just as important as the salt, rennet, and cultures that you add to make cheese. So I think it's more useful to think about the ingredients of cheese making as the ingredients of milk plus the other things that you add. So these are the ingredients of milk, as I like to conceive of them. I'm a visual learner, if you can't tell. I have a liberal arts background, not a science background, but I am fascinated with cheese, and I've asked a lot of annoying questions to people a lot smarter than me over the last, 13 years or so of trying to learn about cheese. And so here's what I've come up with as the best way to explain what milk is made out of: milk components. So we all know that milk is rich in protein, right? It's you know, dense in nutrients altogether. So depending on the breed of the animal, the species of the animal, anywhere from 2.5% to 5%, you know, it's a ballpark range of the total volume of liquid milk is protein. And protein in milk is not just little individual proteins floating around. It's packed in a stable, complex bundle of proteins called a casein micelle. And that is symbolized here by a koosh ball. And if you grew up in the 80s like I did, you'll know exactly what this is. This is, it's a model of a casein micelle. So you can imagine here, each rubber band is not even a single protein. It is a chain of individual proteins. So a casein micelle is a bundle of chains of proteins. And proteins themselves are chains of amino acids. So it's like chains of chains of chains in a bundle. It's a little bit complicated, but it is, the takeaway is that it is relatively stable. So we have a lot of solids in milk. We can't see through it. It's opaque because it's filled with things, and a lot of what those things are these little protein bundles. You shouldn't be able to see chunks in liquid milk, hopefully. It's nice and fresh and everything is going according to plan. But you know the solids are there. They're just very, very tiny and spread out. The way that they stay spread out from each other is that you can imagine the tip of each rubber band here. It's like the 105th protein on the chain, or 106th. It is a kappa casein. So that is a negatively charged little protein dangling out at the end of that chain, those chains that are all bundled together. And just like two like ends of a magnet that'll push away from each other and repel, each casein micelle, because it's surrounded by a perimeter of negatively charged proteins, has an overall negative charge and will push away from other koosh balls floating around. So 5% of the total liquid is these proteins, but the proteins are really, really tiny little flex bundles, and they're all pushing away from each other and staying evenly spread out in milk. How do they stay all bundled up tight together? I know you're wondering to yourselves. Well, that's where the minerals come in. So the calcium phosphate, mostly calcium in milk, is represents the minerality. That's what those minerals mostly are. And that calcium is sticky with protein. It is kind of like the mortar of the brick wall. You know, bricks are protein and the mortar is the calcium. So it's holding those proteins together. So the calcium kind of lives inside of these protein bundles when milk is liquid. All right, so that's the anatomy of a protein bundle for all intents and purposes right now. And then we can shift over to lactose. So think about how there's just as much sugar in milk as there is protein. That's really surprising to me, because when you drink milk, it doesn't really taste that sweet. I mean, it's like, you know, would score low. I think if you put table sugar, which is pictured here, in a 5% water solution, it would taste sweeter than milk does. And that's because milk sugar, the lactose, I think is a more complex molecule than sucrose, table sugar. It's a glucose and a galactose hooked together. And that sugar is extremely important for cheese making because it's the food for starter cultures. So starter culture, as you know, milk, salt, rennet cultures, big ingredient in cheese making. And it's what gets the whole process started, as you can guess. And what it does is they are lactic acid bacteria. So they're a specific type of bacteria that eat lactose and turn it into lactic acid. They're very aptly named. And so to make cheese, the first step is acidifying the milk. And the way you acidify the milk is by turning that lactose into acid. And you do that with lactic acid bacteria, those which are informally known by their friends as starter cultures. Okay, so we've got the sugar. When you start to convert this sugar into acid, the milk becomes more acidic, and what you're going to start doing is dissolving away minerals. This is a takeaway that's, I think, the most important key to understanding cheese texture, is understanding the relationship between acidity and minerality. The more acidic your milk becomes, the more soluble environment it is for minerality. So think about how acid rain pits concrete, or you use acid to etch something. So it's a dissolver, and it particularly will dissolve that glue holding those proteins together. So the first step of cheese making, turning that sugar into acid, you're starting to swell up your couche balls because they're not being held so tightly together by that glue that's starting to dissolve into the milk. All right, so that's an important why that sugar and its potential acidity are so important. The fat, I love imagining beach balls just filled with butter fat, right? Beach balls filled with butter. The same way there aren't individual proteins, the most of the protein in milk isn't just little individual bits, it's packaged into a tidy, stable casein micelle. Fat is the same way. You shouldn't have loose butterfat molecules floating around in your milk. They're packaged in globules, milk fat globules, represented here by the beach ball. So the beach ball has a negatively charged membrane surrounding individual butterfat molecules. So a bunch of butter clumped together with the membrane around it. And that membrane, fat likes to stick to itself and push water away. But when you've got these membranes around it, your fat droplets will actually push away from each other, just like the protein pushes away from itself. And it's all the same charge. So the fats are pushing away from the proteins and the fats are pushing away from themselves. I know what you're thinking. If fats are pushing away from each other, then why does a cream line form on top of milk, which is all those fat globules rising to the surface? That's a great question. So down at the bottom, you see those whey proteins there. There are some loose little rogue agent proteins floating around in milk, and one of them is called cryoglobulin, which is like a sweet Power Rangers villain name. So cryoglobulin is a sticky little positively charged protein that tends to stick to fat globules and then stick to another one on the other side, and it kind of creates like these loose connections of sticky fat globules that kind of want to push away from each other, but the cryoglobulin is helping kind of neutralize that desire to push away. And at the same time, as these globules sort of aggregate together, they're lighter than they're less dense than water fat is, so they tend to want to rise to the surface. So the cryoglobulin and the lower density both result in that cream line rising to the surface. But you shouldn't see, if you start making cheese, your milk is pretty much at the body temperature of a cow. Even if you refrigerated your milk to wait to make cheese, the first step of cheese making is heating that milk back up to that body temperature of a cow. That's where your starter filters are going to be happy and active. And at that temperature, if you had loose fat, broken beach balls, basically, you'd see butterfat pooling at the surface. And when you made your curd, that butterfat would be lost with the whey, and it would go down the drain. And no one wants to see butter go down the drain. And no cheesemaker wants to see butter go down the drain, because that's potential pounds, and like particularly delicious pounds that they're losing in a finished product. So in order to protect yield and protect your fat globules, it's important to have equipment that's functioning as it should, and to not handle your milk too roughly. So anecdotally, I know of a cheesemaker in Petaluma who built her milking parlor uphill from her creamery space, so that when she milks her goats, the milk can very gently just gravity flow down into the creamery without having to go through pumps, being pumped from one thing into another, up and down and around. The more you're handling and moving milk, the more likely you are to be rupturing your beach balls. And then you've got free butterfat. You're going to lose that to the whey. And also, there's natural enzymes in milk that will start eating fats, breaking them apart and turning them into aroma. And enzymes breaking down fat and turning it into aroma is an important part of cheese ripening, but we want that to happen later in the caves, more slowly, and the same proportions to protein breakdown, which gives you like savory, meaty flavors. Fat breakdown tends to give you like spicy, animal-y flavors. You want to know what fat breakdown tastes like? Blue cheese. Blue mold is super fat hungry. It's very lipolytic, meaning it breaks down lipids. It emits an enzyme that eats fat and turns it into that funky, animally spicy flavor, which you don't really want in your fresh milk. So you don't want to give those fats a head start breaking down. You want to protect your fats. You want those to be breaking down later, more gradually in the caves, okay? If you're trying to make butter though, you do let that cream line form. You skim it off, and then you beat the heck out of the butter or the cream, right? If you've ever done that, I know in elementary school, we had pioneer days, and we like put on shawls and bonnets and shook milk in mason jars or cream in mason jars until all those fat globules just like can't take it anymore, and they all sort of burst at the same time. And you see those yellowy chunks of butter all of a sudden exposed, and they tend to stick together and push out the watery phase around it. And then you can kind of knead the butter and push out more and more water and salt it, and there you have your butter making process. Okay, but of course, with all of these components in mind, most of what milk is water. And on a normal, cheese recipe, you might only be getting an 80% yield out of that milk. For every pound of milk, you might only end up with 80% cheese. Even if it's a higher percent of water, you're probably going to have some water left over in the cheese, right? There's some moisture. Okay, so let's, with all of these ingredients of milk in mind, you can see now how important these individual ingredients are and how they might interact with the other ingredients of milk that you'd add. Okay, so what would account for differences in milk? If all milk has the same ingredients, the beach balls and the couche balls, then how do cheeses made from different milks taste so different? So I think at the broadest level, the biggest difference that can happen from milk to milk is at the species level. So goat, sheep, and cow. And this is like at the civilian level of noticing. So if you have a regular customer coming in and buying the same cheese every week, it's their favorite cheese, and you switched it up from goat milk to sheep milk on them, or from sheep to cow, they're probably going to notice and be like, what the heck, this really tastes different to me. So what's happening there is that the goats, sheep, and cows, they all have the couche balls and they all have beach balls, but they will probably have different proportions of those. So sheep have a richer milk. We'll see that on the next slide. So they have more couche balls and beach balls on less water, okay? And then goats have leaner milk, so more water, less solids. You're also gonna have the ingredients of your fats and proteins will vary based on the species. So I mentioned that proteins are made out of chains of amino acids. I literally Googled this because I was like, is it just one amino acid that there's like chains of, or are there hundreds or thousands? It turns out there's like 22 And apparently it's debatable. I have no idea how you could not know if something is an amino acid or not, but there's a 20 odd amino acids. And depending on the genetics of the animal, some of those amino acids the animal will make itself, and the others, they have to eat them. Those are essential amino acids. It's essential that they eat them in their feed or their bodies will malfunction. And so based on what they're eating and their genetics, they're going to have different amounts of specific amino acids around. So the building blocks of proteins will vary from species to species. I know that's complicated and goes down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but all you need to know is that like there are ingredients of fats and proteins, and the ingredients of what the proteins are actually made out of can vary from animal to animal. Same with fats. Fats are fat molecules are triglycerides, which is basically a stick with 3 chains of carbons coming off of it, and the length of the carbon and how saturated it is with hydrogen determines how saturated the fat it is and the potential flavor that can happen. So when I'm talking about like what's protein made out of, what's the fat made out of, like the most important takeaway is that when cheese ripening happens, there are enzymes, we'll talk about enzymes later, but enzymes that will start breaking down fats and proteins. And what cheese flavor is, and the reason that milk doesn't smell like much and cheese smells like a lot, is that during ripening, fats and proteins get chopped into pieces so small by enzymes that they literally can get into your nose. Like in milk, they're too big, like a koosh ball is too big to get into your nose. But once it gets turned into cheese and ripened, the little bits get broken up so small that they can get up into your nasal passages and be sensed as aroma. So that's where we're going with all this. Okay, the animal to animal flavors, that the differences, goatiness, sheepiness, cowiness, that's really driven by fat breakdown. So animal flavors live with the fats. Goat fat triglycerides tend to have like the highest concentration found in nature of any natural place you'd find fats of capridic, caprylic, and capriotic short chain fatty acids. I don't know if those are the exact words, but they're all like from the Latin root of capra for goat, right? So we named these short chain fatty acids after goats because of how much of them we can find in goat butter relative to sheep and cow. Sheep and cow might have some capriotic acid in their fats, but just like not as much as goats. So that's a good takeaway example of like how flavor could be different from one species to the other. Okay, so once we've got those, one last note on that. The reason why Roquefort is like the stinkiest, spiciest, most bold blue cheese we can think of is that, as I mentioned, those fats are really, those blue molds are really fat hungry. And the enzymes that come out of those blue molds will eat that fat. And sheep milk is so fatty and rich that you just have the most fuel of any milk type to make blue cheese taste crazy. So there you go, Roquefort, somebody looking for a stinky cheese. Okay, so the same differences that happen from species to species will also happen from breed to breed. So an Ayrshire cow versus a Holstein cow versus a Jersey cow, they might have different proportions of koosh balls and beach balls, and the ingredients of their koosh balls and beach balls will vary based on their genetics and their feed, of course, but on their genetics is what we're talking about now. And those differences from breed to breed mirror the differences from species to species, but tend to be more subtle. So this is more at the cheesemonger level of paying attention. If you have a favorite cheese, you taste every batch that comes in, you deal with that cheese every day, and the cheesemaker switched up the breed of cow on you from a purebred Ayrshire to purebred Jersey, you're going to notice a more yellowy color, a richer texture. Some sensory differences would be apparent to you that like maybe a civilian who comes in after that cheese isn't going to notice as much as you would as somebody working with that cheese more carefully, but it is noticeable by not like a non-sensory professional. Then you get into the individual cows' genetic differences. And so 2 Ayrshire cows standing next to each other in the barn have genetic differences that can account for differences in their milk. So one cow might make more milk. One cow might have more fat in their milk. And based on their genetics, they could have slightly different ingredients to their fats and proteins. So same types of differences, just super, super, super subtle. So at this point, I would love to create some kind of crazy experiment where a cheese maker was getting milk from one cow every day, and you switch the cow up on them, and like, could they tell the difference in the milk and the cheese from one cow to the next? I bet some cheesemakers could. There is a butter maker in the Northeast, Animal Farm, that famously makes butter from one single cow for a famous chef. And that cow, of course, has a name, and I bet they would notice if you switched up the cow on them. All right. So let's say now, for this thought experiment, that we have a whole herd of genetically identical cows that are all the same. They have the same capacity to make milk and out of the same ingredients. What could account for differences from two different cloned herds of cows, or two different cows with the same genetic makeup? So differences could happen based on where in their lactation cycle they are, which we'll talk about later. The richness of the milk varies a lot seasonally based on, you know, how recently they had a calf. And then feed is going to have the biggest impact on the sensory properties of a cheese, genetics aside. So feed is the building blocks of those fats and proteins. You know, I mentioned some of the proteins, the amino acids that animal make based on genetics, and the others they have to eat. So that's really important. Making sure there's enough, you know, carbohydrates, proteins, precursors for fats, all of that. Now, feed is also important because of its microbial profile, which is something we're going to talk about. So the way the feed is made will have an associated microbial profile, and those microbes are going to be reflected in your finished milk, but maybe not in the way that you would expect. So see that like two-way arrow for microbes, like the feed brings the microbes and sends the microbes up to the hand, but also the microbes get on the feed and get up through the cow's mouth. It's a complicated flow chart here, and the best I can explain it is I always assumed when I was first learning about cheese that cows were these like magical microbe filters. Like they're just like mowing down, like nom nom nom, eating all the microbes, and only the cool microbes that made good cheese could get through. Like they were the selective pressure that decided which microbes could get there, because otherwise it just seems like chaos. You know, like cows are up in the Alps and they're eating these wild grasses and flowers, and all of the microbes of raw milk are, you know, are going through them. They're picking out the best ones. In reality, even though cows have a super rich microbial gut, their rumen, their first stop on their four-chambered stomach, is a giant fermentation chamber with trillions of bacteria, all helping to break down their grass and turn it into butter, right? We could eat grass all day and we'd never make any butter. We'd starve to death because we can't digest it the way that a ruminant can, like a cow, a goat, and sheep. So microbes are really important to their digestion, but where they actually make the milk in their bodies, in their udder, it's an almost microbe-free zone. So all the microbes are filtered out in the milk-making process, and it's pretty much sterile as it's being made. So how does raw milk microflora get into the milk then? Well, French scientist has recently published that 80% of raw milk microflora comes from the skin of the teat. So basically the outside of the cow, not the inside of the cow, which is mind-blowing to me. So whatever the cow is eating is probably all over her body too. She's like laying around in the pasture or in the barn. So that microbial profile of the feed does matter and does come from the cow, but on the outside, not on the inside. Also, a lot of microflora in milk. Well, a lot depends on the farm, but definitely always some would come from other environmental factors besides the feed, like dirt and poo. So there is a commercial culture. I actually just saw on Instagram a microbiologist post a slide of Enterococcus faecium, which is another way to pronounce faecium would be like faecium. And it's a common microbe found in poo, and it was isolated in raw milk camembert as one of the biggest contributors of delicious raw milk camembert flavor. And they now make it in a lab, and you can like buy it in freeze-dried form in like a culture. Like they're not culturing it using poo anymore, but they like found it in milk. That's where it came from, or in cheese. They now have isolated it, and you can buy it and put it in your cheese. So fun fact. We have a really clean barn because we make a cheese called Windermere that's high moisture and low acid, and so we have to be really careful with the milk that goes into it. It's a soft raw milk cheese, and we win milk quality awards in the state. You know, they test the milk, they see how many bacteria are there, and we kept winning these milk quality awards. We're really proud of them. And so we had this French cheese consultant come, and we showed him all the awards hanging on the wall, and he was like, "Cool, dead milk awards." Like, you've got the deadest milk in the state. Like, you need to just put a teaspoon of manure in there and it'll like make your cheese taste a lot better. And we're like, no. Andy Keeler is like, shut it down. Get this guy out of here. Because obviously there's food safety risks associated with that approach. But there are things that you can do to create a microbially rich profile in your barn, like and select for positive microbes, which we'll talk about later. But it's really interesting that in order to have a suitable milk for raw milk cheese making, you have to control the ecology of your barn and the cow's environment, not just how healthy your cows are. Okay, real talk. All right, so let's move on. This is kind of a thesis slide, so we're going to go a little deeper in each one of these things. So let's talk about the difference from species to species of milk. I did mention that, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but it is true that sheep and cows and goats can have different sizes of beach ball and couche ball. For instance, goat and sheep's couche balls are smaller than cows on average, and their fat globules tend to be too. I think goats have like the smallest couche balls and sheep have the smallest beach balls. In any case, this is not a slide talking about the relative size of the couche balls and beach balls from species to species. I did algebra here, which was really hard for me. And I sized the image to reflect the relative percentage of fat and protein from animal to animal. So the sheep couche ball is bigger here because there's more protein in their milk, if that makes sense. So it's just, for me, it's easier to look at this kind of visual representation and understand the differences in milks than looking at a chart full of numbers, which is where I got this information. So when Andy and Mateo, my bosses who started Jasper Hill Farm 16 or 17 years ago now, they bought a farm. They didn't have any farming experience. They thought about like tofu and beer making, and then they settled on cheese, and then they looked at sheep first because they love sheep milk cheeses. And their sheep are kind of easier to handle than cows. You can use them to keep, pastures open. They're just like nice little animals to have around. But they did this math and they looked at these cheese wedges and they're like, oh, no, no, no. It would take 300 to 600 sheep to make the same living as 50 cows. And they had just bought and were fixing up a 50 cow barn. So it became obvious to them right away that the business model that they were working on was only going to work with cows because of that giant wedge of cheese, how much cheese you end up with at the end of the year. Part of this is counterintuitive. So look at how much more solids there are in sheep milk. It means that there's less water. There's more fat, there's more protein. For every gallon of milk, you end up with more cheese. So why is that little cheese wedge so small at the end of the year? It's because you can only milk a sheep like 6 months a year, whereas a cow, it's 300 days, so more like 10 months a year. And so fewer milking days. And then for every day that you do get milk, you get like 10%. So just so much less milk per animal per year. So even though you get more cheese for the milk, you just don't end up with that much cheese at all. So you need a lot of animals, to add up to that amount of cheese. Interestingly, 1,500 pounds is like the average weight of a pallet of cheese that would like go on a truck into the distribution chain. So the average pallet weight at GFI is around 1,500 pounds. So whenever we talk about like, oh, we just got like a few more cows, or, I think we can like, if we rotate them out, like we can have a few more cows on the farm. Doesn't sound like much, but to me, I'm thinking like on the sales and marketing team, like, how are we going to sell another 3 pallets of cheese? Cows can just make an incredible amount of cheese throughout the course of the year. Okay. Goats are somewhere in between. They have longer lactation cycles on average. They give you more milk every day than a sheep, but they have very lean milk, so more watery milk, less solids overall. And so you're still not getting anywhere close to cows, even though you've got a little bit more milk to deal with. Water buffalo is like an old school kind of cow, like a less modern bovine, and they make less milk. A little bit shorter lactation cycle, a little bit less milk, but super rich milk. Still doesn't make up for, what a modern dairy cow can do for you. But the richness of the milk is incredible. When I used to work at a cheese shop, we had water buffalo yogurt. We actually had a yogurt at one point in time. We had a yogurt for each one of these species, and we could do a vertical tasting of like unflavored plain no strain, like whole milk yogurt. And it was really interesting to see the texture differences between them, because yogurt is, unless it's a strained Greek yogurt, it's 100% yield product. You put milk in a cup, you culture it, and it kind of turns into a gel. And so the wateriness of the milk as it starts related to the texture of the yogurt. So the goat yogurt was always like pretty much drinkable. The sheep yogurt was like nice and thick and rich, but not nearly as rich as the water buffalo, which you could like flip out of the cup and it would stand up straight. It was like the texture of Greek yogurt, but just pure milk. Just so rich, that milk, so fatty. All right, so let's move on. We've only got so much time today. Don't go nuts when you study on breeds. You'll drive yourself crazy. People spend their whole careers just trying to fully understand one breed of cow, let alone understanding the entire landscape of milking animals that could be used for cheese making. So this is like just skimming the surface of the different breeds of each type of animal. These are somewhat popular breeds. But the best way, I think, to study for this aspect of the exam, keep in mind there's maybe going to be 1 or 2 questions on breed. Name the top 5 PDO cheeses you can think of. You know, Parmigiano Reggiano, Comté, Roquefort, like low-hanging fruit. List the name protected cheeses that you can think of. 5 tops. Know the breed of animal associated with those PDO cheeses. You're all set. Don't go any farther down the rabbit hole than that. Don't try to memorize how their components are different, other than broad takeaways like Jerseys that were bred for butter production. They give really rich milk. Like, that's probably about as in-depth as those kinds of questions are going to be. This whole exam generally is broad and shallow. There is a ton of ground to cover, and it doesn't get too nitty-gritty. So just keep that in mind. I know it's really tempting to go down rabbit holes. It's really nerve-wracking when you see how much there is to know, but just keep in mind that they're not going to drill down to super deep, obscure things. They're not going to try to really trick you. They just want to know that you have a working familiarity with these concepts for the most part. Holstein cows, I think it is important to know that they're associated with most commercial scaled dairies, especially in the United States. And Holstein cows are really good at giving really decently rich milk, and a ton of it. But they're really have been bred for more modern production, like reed indoor production. So if you have a herd of grazing Holsteins, you've probably been like selectively breeding Holstein cows specifically to be good grazers. We use Ayrshire cows at Jasper Hill Farm because we're on a rocky hillside farm up in Vermont, and our cows might have to walk up a mile a day depending on which paddock they're heading to and back. They go out twice a day after each milking to a fresh paddock of grass at a different part of the farm. So foot and leg health and like agility was more important to us than how much milk those cows can make every day. Ayrshires give a similar proportion of fat and protein and richness as Holsteins, and they can deliver a good amount of milk too, but they're not going to give you as much milk as a Holstein cow bred to do that specifically. And they're better at converting grazed grass into milk than a typical Holstein cow would be, unless you've selectively bred those Holsteins for it. So that's just something to keep in mind. I mentioned a little bit here, like the size of the fat globules varying from cow breed to cow breed. Jersey cows were bred for butter. You know, without realizing it, what's happening at a molecular level, humans bred a cow to just give like very large and very abundant fat, like beach balls, right? Easy to churn into butter, really big, easy to break, and lots of them. So it can actually be challenging to make cheese from Jersey milk because, especially at certain times in the lactation cycle, the cows just have too much butter and there's not enough protein to like reach around all the fat globules and trap in all of the water and fat there is. So there can be, you know, technical issues with a cheese that has too much fat if the recipe isn't designed for it. Okay, let's move on here. Oh, I love this. This was like a screenshot from National Geographic on my mom's iPad, and it shows sheep at the Indiana State Fair getting like their glamour shots done. It's amazing how different each one looks. And the dude on the right, I hope, is sedated, but he's fine, he's alive, he's being analyzed to see how valuable he is as a breeding animal. So we romanticize these heritage breed animals, but it's business, and people obsess over making like the perfect specimen, the way that they look and perform for whatever you know, purpose they were bred for. it's really cool to look back at the history of these different types of breeds used in cheese making and see where in the world they came about and what the circumstances were that led to their being bred the way they are. You know, it might have something to do with the climate or the landscape or what kind of product that they needed for the economy. It's really cool to start digging deep. But again, don't go too far down that rabbit hole for the test, just for your own edification. Okay, let's talk about feed. So, how many times have you been asked for grass-fed cheese on the cheese counter? That is definitely a consumer preference that drives marketing with cheese. I think this consumer preference and the wariness around grain-fed milk really comes from the beef industry. So back when the internet got invented and humans could see where their food came from, they got sort of wigged out by farms. And one practice that made civilians uncomfortable is combined animal feeding operations, like feedlots for beef, where cows are like hanging out inside, eating corn all day, putting on a ton of really marbled, fatty beef, and then weren't super healthy, because it's not a super healthy thing to do to a cow. And then, you know, the bottom line was valued over other things. You don't have the same motivations for overfeeding grain in the dairy industry. No dairyman worth their salt would be overfeeding grain on purpose because it messes up the cows. Dairy professionals are really more interested in longevity for their cow than their ability to put on marbled fat. And in fact, a fat dairy cow is a bad business. It's like, from a technical perspective, if cows are overweight and they, you know, their weight is fluctuating, if they're burning body fat reserves and it's getting those chunks of broken down fats are being turned into butter fat, that fat, when it breaks down in cheese aging, doesn't taste very good. You get like weird chemically band-aidy flavors. So fats made fresh out of like the cellulose in grass is a much tastier way to make fat. So having a really steady body weight for a cow, keeping her feet healthy. If you're feeding too much grain, basically the cows are turning those carbs, that sugar, into acid, right? They've got acid producing microbes in their room in that big fermentation chamber there. So their whole body gets too acidic. It's called acidosis. It can actually start dissolving minerals out of their bones and cause foot problems and other like weird health issues, liver issues. So that's why people are uncomfortable with overfeeding grain and beef lots. But it's really like, it would negatively impact profits for a dairy farm because grain is expensive and you don't get better milk from overfeeding grain, and you have cows that can't, you know, spend the amount of years you planned on being a productive member of the herd. So grain is used a more carefully in the cheese making industry for sure. And it is important for a lactating dairy cow. A lactating dairy cow needs more energy, like it needs more carbs than a beef cow would, than, you know, a grass-fed beef cow. So a lot of times the cow's making, gosh, you know, gallons and gallons of milk, 50 pounds of milk a day maybe, and doing this while also cooking a calf, making, you know, she's pregnant, she's got her next calf on the way. And just trying to subsist off of lettuce while doing that is really hard. So she needs more energy. She's got really high metabolic demands as a lactating dairy cow. So grains are used to give the cow enough carbs, enough energy to complete all of her vital functions, especially putting together proteins in the udder. For some reason, if she's got an energy deficit going on, she can't hook together complete koosh balls. You end up with like random rubber bands floating around in the milk, and those degrade really quickly to their component parts, amino acids, which are made out of nitrogen. And so you end up with basically ammonia in the milk, right? When protein breaks down, you get ammonia aromas. When cheese ripens in a cave, it smells like ammonia. Animal waste often smells like ammonia from the breakdown of their proteins. So if there's unstable proteins in the milk because she's not getting enough energy, you end up with ammonia in the milk. Ammonia in the milk is no good. Even like a big commercial industrial dairy farm is measuring milk urea nitrates, basically ammonia levels in milk, because it's related inversely to yield. So you're not getting enough protein It doesn't register as protein if it's ammonia. So the more energy the cow has, the right amount of energy means she can make complete stable proteins that don't degrade into ammonia, and you get more solids in your milk, and then you get a bigger paycheck from the milk truck, or you get a better cheese result. When you're trying to make cheese from milk that's ammoniated, it will buffer acidity that you're trying to make with your starter cultures. And so it looks like your starter cultures aren't doing anything because you started out with milk that's like the wrong pH. So it really just sets the stage for a non-ideal cheese make that day. So there's a lot of reasons to watch that and to make sure that you're giving the cows enough grain when they need it in their lactation cycle. A lot of modern dairy farms actually have RFID tags on the cow, so they walk up to a feed wall and they get an exact portion of grain for their nutrition needs, because it's that important to get it just right. However, grains, yes, they're important for dairy cows. It's not essential. There are certified grass-fed cheeses that are made without any grains at all, and people are doing that because civilians are worried about feedlots and overfeeding grain, not because they think it's a better way of doing it. It's harder and it tends to be more expensive. You can do it though. If you have a completely grass grazed system, you usually would have to seed your pasture to make sure you have enough carbohydrate rich grasses, like starchy enough grasses. And you'd also probably supplement with non-grain things, like you'd put sugary supplements in your cow's ration to make sure that they're getting enough energy if you're not feeding grain. So you kind of have to go through a loophole to make sure that your cows are staying healthy enough if you're 100% grass fed. But farmers can do it, and they can do it while keeping their cows really healthy, and they can do it naturally too. It's just a much bigger challenge because of the energy requirements of a modern dairy cow. We've bred this cow to do a lot more than she'd naturally be doing. And we care a lot more about how good that milk is. So fibrous grassy feeds, forages is the name for like the other category of feeds that you'd feed the cow. So fiber is really important. Either she's getting too much grain, she's getting, her body's getting too acidic, but also she might not be getting enough fiber. Fiber is what triggers the cud cycle. And the cud cycle, ruminating is like the activity of cows chewing cud. That's really important to keep her body balanced and healthy. It's a time when the milk is made, really rich, beautiful milk is made the most efficiently and rapidly is like during rumination. So when a cow is ruminating, she's literally making you awesome milk. And if she's not getting enough fiber, so that the pathway of food here, it goes into the rumen, she's eating, she's going into the rumen, the big, like lawnmower bag sized stomach chamber packed with whatever she's eating. There's powerful muscles churning, agitating that feed, exposing it to that mechanical agitation, but also the chemical, the enzymes from gastric juices, and then also all of those microbes are emitting enzymes, breaking down that feed, fermenting, creating digestible parts out of that really fibrous grassy feed. So once it gets worked down to a rough paste, it can pass into the reticulum, which is the second chamber there. And the reticulum has little fingers that sense fibrousness, and you can see like a little like whirly-do there, circular loop, where if the feed is suitably fibrous as it should be, it'll create a bolus, like a ball of fibrous feed that she'll burp up, and she'll chew it. She'll like chew it between her molars. It's a shearing action. It like shreds it into finer pieces. It creates increased surface area on the feed. And then she's coating that feed with her saliva, which has like an opposite charge that helps microbes stick to the grass. Otherwise, microbes and grass don't want to stick together. But if you shear it with your molars and cover it with spit, then the microbes can stick to the feed and actually break it down. And so that's, she'd swallow that again, and then she'd have much better time digesting that fibrous feed after that cud chewing process. And then it can pass, makes its way, if it's fine enough, it's being broken down continuously, it's just passing right through the reticulum, it doesn't get hung up, goes into the omasum. The omasum is still being studied and understood by scientists, but basically it is like, it's a place where dehydration happens. They know that for sure. A lot of the wateriness is being pulled out, and so the food is getting concentrated, and then it can go into the abomasum, which is the part of the cow stomach that's the most like a human stomach. It is it's doing the same thing a normal human stomach does, and which is interesting. It just took all of those steps to get the food to a place where it could be normally digested. Then it goes into the, the intestinal tract. And at all places in this, nutrients are being extracted from the food, going into the bloodstream, being taken to the udders, and being turned literally into fats and proteins. This is a close-up of an udder where we see milk-making cells. So we have the alveoli, which is plural for alveolus. So basically, these grape clusters are where the milk is being made in the mammary glands in the udder. And each grape has blood capillaries around it, bringing all those nutrients from the digestive tract, and they're lined with these milk-creating cells. So the right side of the screen here is a close-up of one of those milk-making factories, one of those cells lining the inside of the alveolus. And in the middle is the lumen where all the milk kind of gathers as it's passing through these cells into the middle. So you can see the red dots there are couche balls being bundled together, hopefully very completely because there's plenty of energy. And then the fat droplets are being made, triglycerides are being cooked together, actually built from scratch, gathering together with each other, floating towards the surface of the cell, and then blooping into the lumen in their charged globule jacket. And then water and minerals are just diffusing straight through the cell right into the lumen phase. Okay, it's technical. This is a little bit about how, where nutrients come from in the digestive tract, and the fact that shorter chain fatty acids tend to come from the feed, whereas longer chain fatty acids come from body fat breaking down, which is what you want to avoid. That's just kind of a crazy chart you don't need to spend too much time worrying about. Okay. This is where we'll talk about the lactation cycle. The crazy lightning bolt up at the top is about how there's a hormone release in the cow called, oxytocin. It's the love hormone. When you get a hug from your buddy, it makes you feel good. You get a little bit of endorphins, makes you want to go hug somebody else. It's a beautiful cycle. So there's an oxytocin release when a calf would start to suckle in nature, or nowadays when the cow's getting cleaned, or when she hears the milking equipment come on. It's like a Pavlovian response, or when she sees or hears the little grain snack she gets during milking. But in any case, when she knows it's about time to be milked, she has this oxytocin release. It causes a contraction of the muscles around the udders, and all of the milk that's kind of being held up in the alveoli then can go down into the gland cistern and be ready to be milked. If you don't know if you're not attuned to your cows and you start milking her before milk letdown, it's called, then you can stress the udders out and she can be more likely to have an udder infection. And likewise, if you keep milking after she's done giving you milk, you can stress the udder out that way. So there's a lot of skill involved in good herd management, and there's a lot of technology available to automate that sensibility and to make sure that you're milking your cows very, very carefully. Automatic milking parlors like what Rogue Creamery installed. It sounds like a crazy sci-fi industrial concept, but it actually is implemented on a relatively small scale and really carefully milks those cows and gives you a ton of data. It's really interesting. Okay, ask Dave Gremmels about it if you ever have the chance to meet him. Okay, so we're going to look at the lower left-hand corner of the screen about lactation cycles. So we say that when a cow starts giving milk, she freshens, and a cow freshens right after she has a calf. Makes sense in nature. A lactating mammal is going to start lactating after they give birth. So calving happens, then the cow freshens, but that first milk is called the colostrum. It has a ton of antibodies in it, which really helps build the calf's immune system. It's super rich in fat and protein, and it's garbage for cheese making. Those antibodies will actually attack starter culture, and you can't get the curd to coagulate if you have put a cow's milk that's too fresh into the vat. So not only is it really important for the calf to get that milk, it's no good for cheese making anyway. So usually for like the first week or several days, you're isolating that colostrum, feeding it to the calf. And then once her milk normalizes, that's when you start using the milk for cheese making. So this is a 1-year cycle, 365 days, right? And so calving happens right up at 12 o'clock there. And then by 3 o'clock, quarter of the way through the year, her reproductive cycle has sort of normalized and recovered. And that's when, in most commercial dairy operations, you're looking to breed your cow back in. So your wanting to initiate another pregnancy right around that 90-day mark after freshening. So at first she's just giving you milk, and then it's usually it starts out with a lot of milk and it's really rich, and then the richness drops off sort of quickly, and then slowly over the course of the 10-month lactation cycle, you're going to get less milk, but it's going to get richer and richer and richer over time. So then she's bred back at the 90-day mark, and then you would milk her for, you know, up until 10 months after her calving, her last calving. And then at that point, she's 2 months away from having that calf. You're going to dry her off, give her a break from milking, let her put all of her energy into finishing up that calf, and then she will freshen again after calving again. So it's usually a 1-year cycle where a cow will have 1 calf a year, and will take 2 months off from milking. So you call cows that are in that resting period dry cows, or just, you know, cows that aren't being milked for any reason. So usually they can hang out in a different area of the farm. Their feed is important, but slightly less specialized for cheese making purposes, more just for, you know, prenatal care. And then the cycle continues. Okay. So we'll move on from here. We are running short on time. Nathan, how long would you like this presentation to be? I know I'll be back on soon to continue on with cheese making.
Yeah, no, I would say continue to go and fulfill all this information. If there's people on here that need to exit to do something else, please do so. Again, this is being recorded, so I'll make it available for everyone later if you do have to leave. But if you have time, Zoe, please keep going.
Will do. I could do this all day. I just love talking about cheese. All right. So where does milk microflora come from? We talked about this on the slide where we looked at differences, what drives differences in milk quality, genetics, feed, environment. So this is really where we're seeing all the different ways that microbes could be introduced into the milk. That picture of the barn, there's nothing good or bad. It's a typical picture of a dairy barn, right? There's like manure spatter everywhere. There's litter being tossed. There's a dude in coveralls. He looks pretty clean. It looks relatively under control. It's relatively dry. But it looks chaotic microbially, right? That's real. So it takes a lot to create a barn that's ideal for raw milk cheese making. When this picture of the udder in the middle, that is from a chart of grading milk quality or cleanliness of a barn. There'll actually be like a dairy inspector that will go in and have all the bubbles lined up. And this is like best case scenario, freshly shampooed, ready for the 4-H show. Never a cow looks like this normally. And then on the other end of the spectrum would be a cow so caked in mud and manure that you couldn't even make out what you're looking at. So this is definitely a very, very clean milk would come from this cow who's been shampooed and her tail blow dried. Microbes can also be introduced besides, you know, dirt and manure and feed and people and animals through water. So the water that you're using to clean equipment in the barn. And that tends to be non-ideal. So you really want a very, very hot water to be able to sanitize your milking equipment afterwards, or you can get biofilms or buildup of microbes that will actually build like a little protective layer over themselves and be really hard to get rid of through normal cleaning procedures. So equipment that's functioning properly is really important. And this sounds sort of abstract and like how would you ever know? But we had a cheese that we were experiencing. It was just getting gradually not as good over time. And we were, you know, tasting it, grading it, and the grades were just sort of declining. And we were scratching our heads, and the cheese make seemed to be going fine. They were hitting all their targets. And they finally figured out that they had a heat pump that was malfunctioning in the barn. And the sanitation cycle was like 10 degrees Fahrenheit too cool. And it was still super hot, but it wasn't hot enough to prevent biofilms from building up. And we were getting a bunch of non-ideal microbes in the milk that were manifesting in the cheese ripening. And it was noticeable to, you know, cheesemonger type sensory evaluators. Okay, so really good equipment, really good cleaning practice is very important. It's as important as making sure the right microbes are there in the first place. One thing we didn't talk about with feed, on that feed slide, there was like the big marshmallows. the big plastic wrapped hay bales that you'll see in the field, especially like in upstate New York. So, you know, around the Northeast, if you've ever driven around the summertime, you see those big marshmallows in the fields. And what that is fresh, wet grass that's been wrapped in plastic to create an anaerobic environment where it will spontaneously ferment. You can also add like starter culture, or you can add like powdered propionic acid, which is kind of like pickles it. And the idea is that you want to acidify and ferment the feed to preserve it when it's wet. And that prevent, you know, if you can acidify it, then it won't rot if it's wet. And in wetter climates like the Northeast, it's really hard to count on enough sunshine to create a nice dry hay bale, which we're looking at in the upper left-hand corner here. It takes like 4 days of sunshine at a low relative humidity to get nice dry hay. So fermented feed, haylage, fermented hay is called haylage, fermented grain is silage, and I think when it's all mixed together, it's baleage, but in any case, if it ends in AGE, that indicates that it is fermented, and that's probiotic. It preserves the nutrients, it preserves the feed. It's not bad for the cows, but it has a microbial profile that messes up your cheese. If you've ever seen a blown wheel with a lot of little air holes and it gets like fissures and puffy and it smells like farts, Clostridium and butyric bacteria are associated with fermented feed, and they cause that weird gassing, not beautiful eyes in Swiss cheese, but like little gross tiny bubbles and very off-putting aroma. So it's illegal to use fermented feed in the Alps where they're making Alpine style cheeses, raw, you know, beautiful raw Alpine style cheeses. But in the British Isles, you see really nice raw milk cheddars, and it's a super wet climate and they're feeding fermented feeds. But the cheddar recipe is kind of designed, it evolved with that feeding system, and it is ideal for knocking out those pesky microbes because the cheddaring process is stacking those curd blocks, giving the curd time to create acidity, creates so much more acidity than you'd get in an Alpine style cheese that that helps kill those bacteria, a really acidic place. Then you grind up that acidic curd into little tiny pieces and put salt directly on it. So you've got salt and acid going all the way through your curd before you even get it into the molds. And that effectively wipes out the ability for those gas-blowing microbes, the Clostridium and the butyric bacteria, to do any harm. On the other hand, with Alpine style cheeses, those cheeses evolved on the side of a mountain in the Alps, and where they were trying to make cheese in a cauldron in a shack in the middle of nowhere, and they didn't have a lot of space or time, and so they're trying to get milk in and out of the vat as quickly as possible, making one giant cheese from one milking, the shape of the cauldron. Instead of time and space for the cheddaring process, they lit a fire under that cauldron, and cooking the curd was a way to dry it down and make a nice hard cheese that could last like a cheddar, but without the acidity or space it would take to cheddar. And so cooking the curd is a way of creating a nice dry curd without acidity. So you end up with a low acid cheese and in a giant 80-pound wheel. And when you salt the outside, it can take months for that salt to migrate to the middle of the cheese. And you don't have the acidity to help ward off those pesky microbes. So fermented feed can ruin an Alpine style cheese where it would have a negligible impact on cheddar style cheese. So just something to keep in mind. We started making alpha tolman and Alpine style cheese. We were buying milk from a neighbor who was feeding beautiful, really well homemade haylage, and we were like, yeah, it'll be fine. They have a really beautiful milking parlor. It's like really clean milk. They kept beating us for milk quality awards, and 3 or 4 months into ripening, all of our cheeses bloated and started teetering on the shelves, and we had to feed it all to pigs. And that's why we have a salami program. Okay. It turns out it does matter. Okay, so I'm not going to get too far into the technical aspects of milk quality, but basically there's ways that farmers are evaluated on the quality of their milk. It's bacterial on the one hand and the physical components on the other hand. The ingredients of milk on the one hand and the bacteria that's there. And usually it's the standard plate count, the way it's being evaluated is just how many colony forming units per milliliter of milk. And it could be good microbes that could make your cheese taste great, or it could be bad ones. It doesn't matter. It's just like how many microbes are in the milk. They do that standard plate count, just like how many CFUs, colony forming units. Then they do a preliminary incubation count, which is after the milk has been refrigerated, and then they see how many cold tolerant microbes there are. Then they heat the milk and do a test to see how many heat tolerant microbes there are. Then they look specifically, you get petri dishes that will only grow coliform type microbes. And so they'll see how many coliforms are there, which is an indication of how much manure got into that load of milk. And then there's E. coli, which is a specific kind of coliform. And that's the family of coliforms where E. coli 9H57, the kind that will make you sick, lives. So there's a lot of E. coli that it has a neutral impact on your health. It doesn't do anything. It might even make cheese taste better. In fact, I think that Enterococcus faecium is technically an E. coli. So there's one bad E. coli actor that you're looking for. And so if you're looking for E. coli as a family in general, then you know if there might be a chance that there's the bad kind there, which is why you look for that. And then Staph aureus is an important thing that is a microbe that's looked for. And staph is a different kind of microbe than a coliform, the Staphylococcus. So Staph aureus is a very specific type of staph. There's also good staphs that make flavored milk. There's a very specific type of bad staph, and it creates a toxin that makes you sick, and that toxin survives pasteurization. So if you have a ton of staph in your milk, which usually comes from like mucous membranes of the cows instead of from poop, it's like from their nose or whatever. So staph, and certain animals tend to be sort of carriers for it. So if you have a ton of staph in your milk and then you pasteurize it, it could still make somebody sick. You could kill the microbes, but the toxin that they produce could survive. And so that's why they're of particular concern. So it's really, when you talk about microbes that can make people sick in cheese, it's E. coli 9H57 or whatever, Staph aureus, Salmonella, and Listeria, right? It's really only 4 microbes, which is amazing. There's like millions that could get into the milk, and really only 4 bad guys. And there's certain things that you can do to reduce the risk for specific ones. So you can test the animals in your herd to see if you have any Staph aureus carriers. And if you do, you can turn them into hot dogs. You can try to reduce the amount of poo that gets into your milk. With Listeria, which we all know about is especially a risk for immunocompromised or pregnant people. That is associated with fermented feeds, actually. So fermented feed tends to be a place where Listeria gets into a milk making and cheese making environment. It's also just on dirt, like it's just around everywhere. So when you have to change your shoes before you go into a cheese ripening or a cheese making space, that is particularly trying to ward off any Listeria getting into the building. And then Listeria likes cool, wet places like a cheese cave. So it's hard to avoid growing a lot of Listeria if it gets into your facility. Okay, we've talked about pathogens. So all of those tests are like, even liquid milk producers will be doing that, but it does influence cheese quality for reasons you can imagine. Then they're tested on how much fat and protein. So you get more for a richer milk, more money than for milk that's just watery. They also do tests where they point this like laser gun at the milk and can tell right away if you've watered it down. Cabot has one of those. So when they're getting loads of milk in, they can do some rapid testing to see if somebody's just trying to get paid more by putting water into their milk. But you would get paid especially more if your milk was richer, had higher solids and lower water. Somatic cell count is white blood cell count. So white blood cells are, would ward off infection. So if you usually have a baseline somatic cell count that you watch as a farmer, and your herd just tends to have a certain number of them. And if you see a spike, then you might have a sick cow in the herd. And so that's a number that's watched so you can manage herd health accordingly. When a cow has an udder infection, which is called mastitis, you would see a spike in their somatic cell count. So that's just an indicator that farmers would use to keep an eye on herd health, because a lot of times you'd see that somatic cell count spike before you'd see any symptoms evolve. Okay, and minerals, and of course milk, urea, nitrogen. We talked about that. Farmers are going to be looking at their how much milk, urea, nitrogen, the ammonia in the milk. If that spikes, that means they might need to increase their grain ration so their cows have enough energy to turn all their protein bits into complete koosh balls, right? All right, we know about the MUNs. Okay, so when we're talking about categories of microbes for cheese making, these are categories that were named by the commercial culture companies, the people who are going to sell you cultures to make your cheese. So lactic acid bacteria are the acid producing microbes that you would purchase. You purchase your starter cultures. So you have a lot of different ones you can choose from, and some of them are mesophilic, where they like sort of a medium cow body temperature to be really active, and some of them are thermophilic. They like hotter conditions, philic liking thermo, heat. So Thermophilic microbes, you're going to want to use your starter cultures, thermophilic starter culture, if you have a recipe that calls for heating your curd. So if you're trying to make an Alpine style cheese where you're mimicking lighting that fire under the cauldron to heat up your curd and dry it down, if you do that and you're only using mesophilic starters, you're going to stall out any acidity production. So you want to make sure you've got a group of microbes ready to take up the torch and continue to make acidity and help with getting your proteins ready to coagulate. By having probably a blend of meso and thermophilic cultures. So you'd use those depending on the recipe for what you're trying to accomplish. So that would typically be on a test. Cooked curd cheeses are associated with thermophilic starters. Mesophilic starters are associated with like tones, uncooked, unpressed, medium textured cheeses. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about starter culture, and then everything else, if it doesn't make acid, it's called an adjunct culture, a ripening culture, a secondary flora, non-acidifying microbes of any sort. So they could be the propionic bacteria that make really pretty eyes in Swiss cheese. They could be linens, so the commercial culture responsible for making tacky orange wash rinds. Penicillium camemberti, the bloomy rind that you find growing on cheese. Cloveromyces lactis, we call it KL, is a yeast. And yeast is added to most cheese recipes as the thing that grows first on the rind. So yeast tend to be more acid tolerant. A fresh cheese is pretty acidic. And when you have a yeast present, which a lot of times is just naturally in the environment, it's on our skin and just around, but usually we'll add it to make sure there's enough yeast to start to neutralize acidity on the surface. So it can live in a more acidic place, it can grow, it tends to, if you don't have enough yeast or don't create the right conditions for yeasting, we usually keep the cheese in a warm, humid room for a couple days before we put it in the cool cheese cave to really let that yeast go nuts. And if we skip that step, or if the yeasting room is too cold, or if our yeasts aren't healthy, then you get like black and blue spots all over the place. It just doesn't create a beautiful, even rind. So yeasts are the colonizers. They're going to grow first. They start to break down proteins, do their life cycle. And then when they break down proteins, they release ammonia, and that ammonia neutralizes acidity, right? Ammonia is basic. It is the opposite of acidic. And it tempers the surface and it literally makes it less acidic so that other microbes can grow. So it sets the stage for the bloomy rinds, the camemberti, or the B linens. So yeast is important as the first dude. The pioneers, and KL specifically is in a lot of different culture blends, and it tends to have a phase of the cheese that just tastes like bananas. Like the 1 week mark, Moses Sleeper, when it just kind of starts to look off-white and a little fuzzy, it tastes like a banana milkshake. Then over time, that yeast, gets taken over by other things, and you develop more typical Moses flavors. Okay, every microbe sort of has its own associated aroma that it can contribute by giving you enzymes that are breaking down those fats and proteins, helping them get small enough to get into your nose. So if the culture company didn't sell you a starter culture, if there's a lactic acid bacteria there and they didn't sell it to you, they call it an NS lab, a non-starter lactic acid bacteria. They're like, well, it's probably pretty good for the cheese make. You can kind of never have too many starter cultures, and especially natural ones. And the more diversity of starter culture, the more balanced the flavor is and the more complex the aromas are. So raw milk is known to have, and especially really high quality raw milk, has a lot of lactic acid bacteria. And the culture company would be like, well, you didn't buy those from us, so they're NS labs. But they could be like the same things that they sell, the lactic acid bacteria. Then if the culture company says, if it doesn't make acid, then it's a contaminant. So even if you have a microbe coming from your environment that's making positive, interesting flavors, the culture company is like, ooh, that's a contamination. So it's just all about like who's trying to sell you what, I think, is where these categories come in. But there's, wild native cultures of all different kinds that can have an impact in ripening your cheese. Another thing to keep in mind is, we have the starter cultures, they eat the sugar, they make the acid. That's a very specific thing. We have the rind microbes that will grow that you can physically see. But that doesn't mean that if you have a ripened cheese that's not cave ripened, that there aren't ripening cultures. So think about a cryovac block of cheddar. It's bland and rubbery when it's first made. It's not great. And then you wait a year and it's delicious, and it didn't grow a rind, but it did ripen. And that ripening happened because there is anaerobic, non-oxygen needing bacteria in that cheese all throughout it, breaking down fats and proteins and creating aromas out of it. So it's not just about the rind microbes, the secondary ripening cultures. It could be any kind of culture, not making acid, but making flavors by breaking down cheese components over time. Okay, so this is just a little more of a deep dive into the lactic acid bacteria. And we're rounding up here. So you guys, we're doing great. We're almost there. So this is just a visualization of what starter culture is doing. It's eating sugar. It's creating the waste product of lactic acid. It's multiplying exponentially. So 1 splits into 2, 2 split into 4. It could take, 15 minutes for the first split to happen, but after a couple of hours, you've got millions of these microbes making acid exponentially more quickly. So acidity starts out happening really slow, and then it starts happening like really much more rapidly towards the end of cheese making. And right away, you're getting aromas. When you walk into a cheese room after you've added the culture, an hour later, man, it really smells buttery and delicious. And when you make cultured butter, you're adding starter culture to cream, you're acidifying it, and you are creating those extra flavors. So a cultured butter has more complexity of flavor from the activity of the starter culture right away. So starter cultures make aromas, right off the bat. But also they have the potential to make flavors. And one of the reasons why a nice diversity of starter culture is a good thing is that after they run out of food and it becomes too dry and salty and non-ideal for them during a ripening, during the ripening process, once they're in the caves, they'll die, break open or lyse, and they will pour out like porridge of enzymes. And enzymes, I keep talking about enzymes. They're the things that break down the fats and proteins and make flavor. An enzyme is a kind of protein that will attack a very specific and predictable place on a molecular structure. So every enzyme goes and chops a different spot on a fat or a protein molecule. And so you can get a predictable flavor by it going and clipping off, a part of a short chain fatty acid, that little goaty fat part will get clipped off by a specific enzyme. So I mentioned that blue mold really, breaks down fats and lets us know what that fat animally flavor is like. So blue cheese has a lot of scissors that specifically go in and start clipping those short chain fatty acids off of that fat. Rennet is an enzyme. So there's a lot of enzymes. Every microbe just has like a bunch of enzymes that they're like either emitting as they eat and excrete, or when they die and break open. And so these scissors are going in and clipping in very specific places. So rennet is an enzyme that we're not bringing to the party using an enzyme. We're just adding it directly. So it's an ingredient in cheese making. It's an enzyme that we're adding directly to the milk. And rennet's job is to go in and clip off that connection of the 106th negatively charged protein at the end of the chain, that fuzzy perimeter of negative charges around the casein bundle. Rennet's job is to go in and clip all of those off. And so instead of the koosh balls pushing away from each other, all of a sudden they can bond. So when you acidify milk, you're swelling up your koosh balls because you're dissolving the glue holding them together. So they're swelling up, they're getting puffed up. And then you add rennet. A little bit later in the cheese making process, you give the koosh balls a buzz cut. They don't push away from each other and they grab onto each other. And then you end up with like a big spongy meshwork of protein trapping water and fat. So fat is just like hanging out along for the ride. And the protein is doing all the heavy lifting of forming a knitted curd. Okay, so that's getting into the cheese making part of things, but as an ingredient, it's important to understand what all of these things do. All right, so this is just a chart to remind us how exponential growth works, same as a starter culture as for a pathogen. So, if you have mayonnaise in the sun and there's one cell of E. coli there, that might not be a big deal right away, and you can eat that and be fine. But if you let it sit out there for a couple hours, that's enough to do some damage, right? Okay, so just important to know how exponential reproduction works. It adds up fast. Okay, so let's talk about pasteurization as the end of the presentation here today. Pasteurization is more complicated than it really needs to be. So what we're looking at here is that there's different levels of pasteurization. So you can legally pasteurize milk in different ways. There's vat pasteurization, which is the most gentle, and possible to do with a vat. So you don't need a specialized piece of equipment. If you can show that you've held your milk at 145 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes, it is legally pasteurized, right? That's the gentlest way to do it. Every time you bump up another temperature, like if you get to a scale where vat pasteurization takes too long, it takes hours to warm milk up, you know, especially if you refrigerated it first, then to keep warming it until it's 145 degrees. And then you have to cool it back down to body temperature of a cow again before you can add your cultures, or you'll shock your cultures. So that could take like half your day, just pasteurizing and cooling your milk. So if you need to get on with the show and maybe make 2 batches of cheese a day, you might invest in a high temp, short time HTST system. And that's a more sophisticated, expensive piece of equipment that is able to bring milk up to 161 degrees for a shorter amount of time and then drop it back down again. So it's a little bit more jarring for the milk and for any cultures in the milk, but it can do the job, and it can do the job a heck of a lot faster than vat pasteurization. So it's usually something that creamers will invest in as soon as they're able to. You have to keep in mind though, every time you jump up another 10 degrees or so, you know, the hotter it gets, the fewer microbes can survive that. So vat pasteurization, you're actually able to retain some native microflora, some nice thermophilic cultures in your milk that could survive vat pasteurization that aren't going to be there if you have an HTST machine. So it's just something to keep in mind. You're getting cleaner and cleaner milk every time you bump up that temperature range. There's a set of microbes that's not going to make it. Then you can, in more industrial cheese making, you have milk flowing through these lines that it passes through a certain point for 1 second, it reaches a super high temperature. And then ultra pasteurization is actually above the boiling point, but under pressure, so it doesn't actually boil, but that messes up and denatures the protein so much that you can't get a knit curd out of it. So you can't make cheese from ultra pasteurized. That's like sterilized, shelf stable cartons of milk that you'd see on a shelf, not in the refrigerated case. So little creamers that don't have to be refrigerated. So with cheese making, it's really the top 3. In Europe, they have heat treated cheeses that they call thermized. And so thermization or thermalization is basically European style pasteurization. And it is just bringing milk up above the danger zone, right? If you've ever taken a food safety class, microbes like to multiply above 40 degrees, right? Above refrigeration temperatures and below 140. So when you're in a restaurant, you're trying to keep hot foods hotter than 140 and cold foods colder than 40, right? The whole cheese making process happens in the danger zone at 40 to 140, especially if you're making raw milk cheese. Your temperature is not something that you're using to control your microbes in a way that can guarantee food safety. You have to use acidity, dehydration, salting, and hygiene practices to control in those cases. Thermization is bringing milk up above the danger zone for less time than the 30-minute mark, right? So with a higher temperature, you don't need to hold it at the same amount of time to have the same effect. And so this is like, okay, it's the lowest temperature gradient and it's a shorter amount of time. There's also just heat treatment that cheesemakers will do to control their risk, if they're making a high moisture, low acid cheese where dehydration and acidity isn't going to help narrow how many microbes get through, they might just gently heat their milk up to like 130 for a few minutes, just to wipe out some potential low-hanging pathogen fruit that might be around that could be effectively sort of taken care of. But the federal government of the United States has shown that you can verify it to be milk to be pathogen free if you follow one of those 4 standards above. So the European model, I suppose the US just came up with a different standard and said, well, like to be super sure, you have to do it this way. Whereas the Europeans have this legal designation of thermized. But in our country, if it's not technically pasteurized, and then as far as the government's concerned, it's raw, you have to wait 60 days to sell it. Thermization is meaningless as far as a regulator is concerned in the US. But there are companies, I know this is hard to believe, but there are large cheese-making companies that will send their milk through an HTST machine to 160 degrees instead of 161 for 14 seconds or for 15 seconds. They just come just barely shy of HTST pasteurized, which is even more pasteurized than vat pasteurization. And they'll on purpose come up just short so they can put raw milk on the label. And that for us is a real bummer. We think that's misleading. We fall into the camp of the Raw Milk Cheesemakers Association, which is now defunct, but they put forth a definition that for raw milk to be real raw milk, thou shall not heat the milk above the body temperature of an animal before renneting. So they're like, well, yeah, if you're making an Alpine style cheese and it calls for heating your milk to 114, that's fine. You can still call it raw milk, just as long as you didn't do that heat treatment before cheese making began. And for them, the time of rennet addition is when a cultured dairy product technically becomes cheese, is when you add the rennet. So that's that designation, and we stick to it. So we actually do have a heat treated cheese in our collection, but on the label we put unpasteurized. So we have raw milk on the label, which means raw. We, no heat treatment at all. We have unpasteurized, which means milk has been heated as a risk assessment or risk management tool. And then we have pasteurized cheeses, because we have to sell those cheeses before 60 days and the federal government requires it. All right, so read Louis Pasteur's wiki page. He's fascinating. He was trying to figure out how to avoid spoilage in beer, actually, and figured out how to end the leading cause of infant mortality, which is tainted milk, because people were moving to cities before refrigeration technology and just trucking more milk from farms. So hooray, Louis Pasteur. But now we've entered what the MIT anthropologist Heather Paxson calls a post-Pasteurian paradigm, which I know you guys are totally aware of, which is, she's meaning to say that back when Pasteur discovered microbes, basically, it was a terrifying new reality. And we're like, oh my God, they're everywhere. They're going to kill us. We've got to kill them all, except for the one that makes, sourdough bread taste good and beer alcoholic and cheese curdle. Okay, those are okay. But only these 5 microbes are okay, kill the rest. And now, Jamie Lee Curtis is on Activia commercials where they recultured yogurt to have extra microbes in it, right? So we're understanding now the value of diversity all over the place in our society. And we're understanding that microbial diversity is usually a good thing, and that there's really only a few bad guys. And in cheese, those 4 microbes of pathogens of concern I mentioned that we're trying to avoid. And otherwise, microbes tend to be neutral to positive in our lives, right? We understand our gut biomes are really important. Cows need those trillions of bacteria in their stomachs to be able to process their food and make butter out of grass. So hooray for post-Pasteurian times. It's about time. All right, I think that's where we're going to stop today. And then I'll be joining you guys at a later date to get deeper into the weeds of the cheese making process. So thanks for this opportunity to geek out. I really love thinking about and talking about these things. And every time I do the presentation, I think of another question to go ask a herd manager or a cheesemaker. So thanks for the opportunity to learn and educate along with you guys.